Sorry, just so I know, if I press the green button, it goes forward.
Yeah, and the one in the back.
We're a little more low-tech in commercial fisheries. All right, thanks, everyone. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about this project on invisible fishers. So in the state of Massachusetts, where we come from, we don't collect any information on subsistence fisheries whatsoever, and there's no actual management-based delineation between sport fishing, sport fishing, recreational fishing, or subsistence fishing, at least in a permitting sense. And I just wanted to point out, because when I workshopped this presentation, this is actually a hidden fisher here. Most people did not catch up on that. But in order to find a lot of these people, we had to do these in person, and we actually had to go to these kind of far hidden away spaces to find people. So probably one of the biggest problems with doing subsistence fishing, especially where we are, is there's no sort of universal definition on what it is, either in a global sense or in North America where we are. So we looked a lot into different subsistence fishing literature, and some of the most common metrics were food insecurity and economic need. In indigenous sense, we see a lot about maintaining cultural continuity and food pathways. In more global senses, we see a lot about subsistence fishing and subsistence fishers being very close in proximity, not only to their fishing grounds, but also maybe small sale grounds, and the use of low-tech gear. There's been a lot of new evidence that we actually used in order to keep our minds a little open to understand that while there's a lot of information and metrics that might historically have been very accurate, there's a lot more information coming out that maybe nutrition and economic need is not the sole reason that people are subsistence fishers. So with all that in mind and using some of our preliminary data, we built this conceptual model on reliance in our area. And we certainly found that nutritional need and food security are very common in all of our respondents. But we also found that reliance was inherently multidimensional. And some of the other important dimensions were psychosocial well-being, social cohesion, and a feeling of community belonging, cultural continuity, and issues that came up around access and infrastructure needs. There we go. We built some research questions in order to guide our research, and probably the most nebulous one is who are subsistence fishers and what kind of metrics do we use in order to identify them. What proportion of our coastal fishers rely on fishing in order to meet their household needs? What are the motivations that are driving this coastal fishing? And how are these motivations different between different demographic groups? So we built a 24-question mixed methods survey, and we translated it into the 8 most commonly spoken languages at home in Massachusetts. All of our interviews were in person. All participation was voluntary. And we had mostly closed-ended questions. We had a couple open-ended, but at the very end of every single interview, we ask all of our participants, is there anything you want to tell us about fishing? And we didn't really expect the level of information we were given. We ended up with this incredibly rich, sort of accidental qualitative data set. So we thematically analyzed it, and we found these 4 major themes with 3 to 4 associated sub-themes. And by far the most common one that people spoke about was this cultural and social aspects. And most people here were actually speaking about health and wellness, either physical or mental well-being, or socialization, how fishing was a big part of their community, how it was their social hub, especially for some of our more senior fishers. You can see this is kind of our area that we're in Massachusetts, and we did visit all of these towns, at least in year 1. This was just a pilot study. But we were only able to actually get interviews in these 4 major areas. So in total, we got 25 interviews in year 1. They were overwhelmingly male participants. We did have one Indigenous respondent who identified as a member of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. But other than that, they were pretty evenly split between foreign-born and US-born participants. We had a really high response rate, probably because we were in person. But our participants in general skewed older, so mostly 60 and up. In order to understand how reliant people were and the ways in which they were reliant, we asked them a bunch of different questions. And one of them was, if you could no longer fish for these species or at this specific port, how much would that impact you and your family? And we had some pretty interesting responses. So when we looked at this in terms of differences between age groups, we did see that a lot of the older respondents did feel that this would be more impactful for them than some of the younger ones. However, there was no statistically significant difference between the age groups. Conversely, we did see some big differences in the heritage groups, and at first they were kind of surprising. So the US-born participants actually noted that they felt that it would be more impactful for them than the foreign-born, even though foreign-born respondents tended to eat more seafood, they tended to fish more often. So there seemed to be a greater nutritional and economic need for them, but they felt that it would be less impactful. So with a lot of our qualitative data, what we were able to realize is that for the foreign-born, they didn't see it as big of an issue because they had this more flexible mindset about it. So if they can't fish here, they'll find somewhere else. If they can't fish this species, they'll find somewhere else. Whereas our US-born, they had this almost hyper-dependence on place. This is the place that they fish every day. This is where they meet their friends. This is the one pier that they can access physically. And they also had a lot of mobility issues, especially the older ones. So this, for them, losing this would be the center of the world leaving. One fisher actually told us that if this one pier left, he would die. All right, and we came up with these 5 metrics of reliance based on some of our closed-ended questions. These are mostly just how much people fish, how they consume their catch, how important it is to them. So we found that over 70% of our respondents fish a minimum of 2 times a week on average. About a quarter of them do fish daily. This is not a separate metric, but this is also mainly retiree age and up, so they have a little more time. 20% said that seafood was a primary dietary protein for them, and of those, most of these were either indigenous or foreign-born. A little more than that consumed at least 3 meals a week, and 68% shared catch with their family or their extended community regularly, and 72% of all of our respondents regularly ate their catch. Sorry, there we go. In all, we had 25 completed surveys, and of those, 19 fulfilled at least 2 metrics or more, which we categorized as having basic fishing reliance. 52% fulfilled at least 3 or more, which we categorized as potential subsistence users. And 20%, 1 in 5, fulfilled 4 metrics, which we consider to be high subsistence reliance. And in general, we recognize that this is only 5 people. This is not a lot of people, but in a state like ours where we deal with increasing food insecurity and threats to federal benefits for nutrition, this is actually a pretty significant amount. So in terms of looking back at some of the literature that we've dealt with and trying to understand what subsistence is and how those kind of translate into our area, we did find that food supplementation was incredibly important to most of our respondents, with 72% consuming and 68% regularly sharing with family, friends, and community. However, we did not find that proximity was important in our area. With over 50% regularly traveling 30 miles or more, most of the respondents we spoke to, we asked them about their different fishing habits, and a lot of them often would go to different states because all of our fisheries are managed, at least coastally, state by state. So they would often go to states that maybe were a little more beneficial for them management-wise, or were, had easier access. We did find that everybody that we spoke to did use low-tech gear, primarily rod and reel, and that the fishing motivations were pretty nuanced, sometimes even on an individual level. We also found it was interesting in asking people about cultural feelings around fisheries. Some people did say yes, but most people said no, but then they would talk more about sort of their individual feelings, their family traditions, their something bigger than that. So in later discussions, we tried to bring a lot more of that family tradition in to sort of tease out what was going on and how people felt about it. So some of our key takeaways. Reliance, again, is inherently multidimensional, and there's so many different key elements to it, and there are overlapping dimensions. We also found that a lot of our fishers, they didn't fit into these discrete categories. They were not a subsistence fisher or a recreational fisher, or sometimes even a commercial fisher. They often did 2 or 3 of them. And sometimes they regularly were subsistence fishers, but they just went out for fun recreationally sometimes. We also found an incredibly high level of reliance across heritage and age classes, and this was present even in food secure homes. We also noticed a lot of issues around infrastructure and safety that were really impacting a lot of people's ability to fish, and this disproportionately constrained our more vulnerable fishers, particularly those with mobility concerns. This area in the picture is actually a rocky coastline, so while there is 1 or 2 piers, a lot of the elderly people around this area aren't actually able to fish from most of the coastline. So we actually came up with, and I'm not going to talk about it at all today because we're almost done, we came up with a bunch of recommendations because we really feel that greater consideration for coastal access and equity is needed in future development in our area. Okay.
Thank you very much. Any questions?
Thanks very much. I was quite interested in your proximity that wasn't effective for you. So how are the fishers traveling? Are they using public transport or own vehicles? Like here in South Africa, proximity is an issue.
Yeah.
You see a lot of the guys walking to their fishing spots. So just interested in how they're traveling those big distances.
So a lot of our coastline, especially coastline like this that might be a little more exclusive, isn't easily accessible by public transport. There is a bus that kind of comes near here, so some people could be doing that, and then biking. We actually see large groups of people in like a van together, so maybe somebody will have a car or a group of people will have a car and they'll all go together, especially maybe the more vulnerable populations. But we also see people with sort of tricked out bicycles, like they'll put PVC pipes on it to hold all of their stuff and all their buckets, and they'll be coming all the way down the like the causeway, maybe a few miles to different areas.